So my name is Ingrid Conley-Abrams, and I'm the library director of an independent school in New York City. I am honored to be moderating this panel of authors of queer middle grade lit. Today we have Kacen Callender, author of middle grade titles King and the Dragonflies and the gorgeous award-winning Hurricane Child, as well as several YA titles. Hi, Kacen.
Hey.
And then we have Lisa Bunker, who is the author of 2 middle grade titles, Felix YZ and Shinobi of July, not to mention out there representing the Rockingham 18th District of New Hampshire, which is amazing. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Good to see you. Also here with us is Mariama J Lockington, author of For Black Girls Like Me, which received 4-starred reviews. Mariama is also the author of the poetry chapbook, The Lucky Daughter. Hi, Mariama.
Hi.
And last, this is my 3rd time moderating a panel that includes Alex Gina. Alex has written 3 middle grade titles, Rick, You Don't Know Everything, Jilly P, spoiler alert, she doesn't know everything, and the award-winning George. Hi, Alex.
Hi.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just coming out of the extremely bizarre and definitely trying several months of long distance learning with my students. And I'm struck by how much their young minds are currently processing. I work with the pre-K to 4th grade group. They're dealing with the pandemic and the grief and isolation that comes with it. They are processing extreme police brutality and violence against Black people, just alongside their everyday child journey towards understanding who they are and who they'd like to be. And while, as a librarian, I wish books were everyone's go-to safe space, for some of them, books are their soft place to land. It's their way of understanding the world around them. It's an access point for validation and loving representation. I was just thinking of Caroline talking to her mother in Kacen's Hurricane Girl when she says, hearing these words is like hearing permission to exist. And I think that's what your stories and your characters do for some readers, especially for those who are underrepresented in middle grade lit, gives them permission to exist. And these are some of the reasons why I, as a librarian and educator, am so grateful for you and all of your work. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with our first question, and all these questions are for all of you to answer at your leisure. Who do you write for and why?
I mean, I think that you just described it so beautifully and perfectly, just kind of like writing for younger people who really desperately need these books as a way to kind of like understand the world around them and to understand who they are and to feel that validation. And I feel like I was on a panel recently with David Levithan, and he said something that was pretty interesting that I hadn't really thought about or hadn't been expressed out loud, where I feel like my books have kind of gone through a journey where with Hurricane Child, I was writing for the young me who really needed that validation and really needed to hear that I was worthy of life and existence, and, you know, basically to say, screw you without cursing to like, you know, the bullies and all the people out there who don't think that my life is worth the same as theirs. But there's been like a bit of a shift as I go to more school visits, as I speak to more young people, and I hear about the topics that are concerning them, and I hear about their thoughts and their opinions. I feel like King and the Dragonflies became more of a shift where I was writing for young people today rather than just me, the past me, where I'm like, I want to have those conversations with them. So I feel like the 3rd book I'm writing right now is in middle grade, and it's kind of like a mix of both, where I'm trying to write for the younger person, but I'm also still keeping in mind, especially these days where there's like so much grief and hostility, as you kind of like described, like the type of book that I think young people really need today to have those conversations.
Yeah, I find that I'm on that similar shift, and I think I may have been on that panel where my first book was writing to the me that didn't have that book, and writing to the all of us that didn't have that book, whether they are young now or they were young, like, because any of us who grew up before 5-6 years ago didn't really have children's books with trans characters in them. So we all, those of us who are book people, still have that hole. And now my 3rd book is about, it has has a rainbow spectrum in it, a middle school queer group, which we didn't have those, but that's what I want to be sharing because that's what I've been finding at schools. And the work that I'm working on now, my work in progress, is about a lesbian photographer from the late 19th century. Because I want to start showing, I want to not just start, but I want to show kids that we go back and we're not just like now. So who I'm writing for and how I'm writing to them is definitely developing the more I write.
Yeah, I would agree. My first book, this is my debut book for Black Girls Like Me. And so I'm still very much in the moment of writing into a void, writing into the book I wasn't able to find when I was searching for things. I was very much a reader, very much always at the library. And so for Black Girls Like Me is that book that sort of I needed to find when I was growing up. But I'm also in the process of, finishing up my second book, which will be out in 2022, which is about two queer Black girls who meet at a prestigious music camp and sort of fall in love. And that book there has been a shift in writing that book because I've been really excited about just writing a love story between, two Black girls who are questioning and not questioning and figuring it out. And so I'm really interested in writing stories for young people who want to find validation, but also are just sort of in that messiness of growing up, right? And that messiness that's also so beautiful, that is a point of curiosity and exploration. And so, and I hope that my stories are able to resonate with all types of young people. But I also specifically want to see more Black and, brown people on book covers and more queer kids on book covers. And so I'm also writing into that void, I feel like, when I'm thinking about my stories and sort of my own perspectives.
I agree with everything that's been said. Definitely writing for child me. But also I'm interested in crafting stories that are compelling enough just as stories and not ever just about some specific demographic experience, that we might also pull in cisgendered heterosexual readers and educate them some. My second book, Shinobi of July, is a really deep dive into the experience of a trans teenager living in stealth in a middle school. And I wanted people to read that who weren't gender variant themselves and get some idea what a kid like that would go through. And I'm also interested, sparking off of something Alex just said, I'm really interested in writing stories that are populated by, like, the majority of the characters are queer in some way, because I think it's very valuable for people to have an experience where they read a book where they're not the majority for once, and they have to think about how, wow, the straight characters are kind of around the fringes of this story, and they're just sort of window dressing to the main thing that's happening in the middle, which is a story of a young rainbow human, but also the story of community and family of choice and friend groups that support and build strength for a character like that. So I'm interested in both. I'm interested definitely in writing for the young rainbow humans, but I also want to have people from outside that sphere encounter them and maybe expand their thinking a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a great experience for a reader who is typically used to seeing themselves centered in a book, overall, get to see themselves in these other roles. I work with a lot of students who fall into the middle grade category, and maybe I'm just partial, but I always feel like middle grade readers are kind of the forgotten ones. I'm looking out for them. I know that a lot of you have written books for other audiences, but at one point you have chosen the middle grade crowd. Thank you. Why is this particular age group important to you, especially versus writing for YA or writing picture books?
I'm happy to start because my heart and soul and everything is middle grade, and if I never write anything that's not middle grade, that'd be okay. And part of it is because there's a bit of me that's 10, right? And that really just lives there. But it's, to me, picture books and being that age is about figuring out what's in the world and learning about what's in the world and having opinions or things like, oh, I like this picture because it's pretty, which is all great. YA is about realizing that the world is chaos and it's actually all like terrible, and no, really the adults don't know anything and we're all going into the pit. And I do enjoy reading that sometimes, but it's a little hard. But middle grade is a bunch of kids who are still being treated as though their opinions are, I like purple, but their reality is they're recognizing that adults don't know everything. And they need and deserve tools to figure out what's actually going on in the world, because so many of the adults in their lives are still seeing them as to be protected. And if you have kids who are especially the white kids, especially the privileged kids, if you have kids who grow up protected, you have adults who don't have any ways to work their empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Alex, I also feel like I'm like a 10, 12-year-old most of the time, and identify with middle grade so much. I think I'm also an educator, and so my favorite age group to work with is sort of the middle grade for a lot of reasons that you just said as well. I mean, I think middle graders are, yes, figuring out that adults don't know everything, right? And they're beginning to have their own identities or try to figure out how to separate their identities from maybe their families. But they're also unfiltered in this really wonderful way that I think sometimes as we get older, we get afraid to ask questions. We get afraid to, speak on something, and we get a little bit more guarded. And I find that when I do school visits with middle graders, and the questions that I get are just unfiltered and curious. And that's what I love so much about writing for this age group. And then also just listening to this age group interact with one another and talk, and remembering sort of the really joyful, imaginative, playful moments of being a middle grader, and then also the really sort of painful, scary, messy parts of it as well. And it just, I don't know, it's where I live. I would also be happy to write middle grade for a really long time.
I've loved what you both said. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
After you, I insist.
Okay. I love what you both said, and I feel like my reason is a little bit, it's a little sadder. Like kind of jumping off of what Mariama has just said about like the pain and the messiness. I feel like I just constantly take quotes from other people. But another interesting thing I heard from someone was the idea that the age range that you primarily write for, or where your heart is where your first pain occurred, and where you're kind of like trying to heal that pain. And when they said that, I was like, oh my God, please. Like I didn't do this therapy lesson with them.
That's how I feel. Oh, no.
Surprise therapy.
Right. But ever since I learned that, I was like, yeah, that is completely true. Like my middle grade is really, like the middle grade age range was really where I had my first hurt, my first pain. I was so like bullied and isolated. And I feel like I'm constantly trying to heal that space. So that's where my middle grade comes. And I do write for like YA and adult for different reasons. But I do think that my like initial love of writing grew from like the roots of like Hurricane Child, grew from like the kind of like pains that I had felt when I was younger, and like trying to heal those pains for myself and then for young people who might be feeling those same pains right now.
This is a tricky question for me because I wasn't really aware of the categories before I got somebody interested in publishing one of my books. I knew YA existed. I didn't know middle grade existed as a separate thing. When I was writing Felix, I thought I was writing a young adult novel. And when I got accepted for publication and the editor said, this feels young to us, can we age your character down and change a few details? I wasn't perfectly happy about that. I was thinking of a high school story, but they were going to publish my book, so I agreed to the changes. And it happened again with Zenobia to a certain extent. Again, I wrote her originally as, say, 15, and they said, no, it feels young. We're doing sort of friend dynamics and awkward first crushes and things like this. And the reason I have a problem with that is because in my own experience, and also watching my own kids grow up, my kids grew up in a friend cohort, all of whom turned out to be rainbow humans in one way or another, later on in life. It's interesting to me how that came together. Unexpressed identities found each other. That's a story idea somewhere. But I was watching them go through high school when I was writing Felix, and they were totally doing the stuff that the conventional wisdom says is a middle grade business in high school. They were doing delicate first experiments with identity, and they were experiencing awkward first crushes and friend group dynamics. And apparently, if the world isn't ending, it's middle grade. And if the world is ending and everything is dark and disastrous, it's young adult. But that doesn't mirror my own experience of the real world at all. So I have a beef with these categories. It's interesting. I'm writing something now which has a 10-year-old narrator, and it's much shorter. And if it gets published, I imagine it would have like abundant illustration in it, like it would be early middle grade. And my character is gender non-specified, so no pronouns and a gender ambiguous name, first person narrator, so it's pretty easy. I don't have to worry about the pronouns. And one of the reveals at the end of the story is they've met a character who's non-binary, and they start to think, well, maybe I am non-binary too. And that feels to me like what I would think of as middle grade. So I do like that I've ended up writing or being published in the market for younger readers, because I think we need to get all of the messages in our works out as early as possible. And I think to the extent that there are folks out there who react badly to what we're writing, I think it's a radical act to go as young as we can. Because if they're saying we can't talk about this stuff in high school, say we're talking about it in 6th grade now. I'm all for writing books in every genre that really give kids permission to explore and question from the very beginning.
There are kids out there waiting for those stories to be told in a way that's accessible to them, and also their reading abilities as well. So I'm personally pumped for a young middle grade renaissance. Please bring it. I've got the school's credit card ready. Let's make it happen.
Great.
So I remember getting to see my first couple of middle grade titles with queer characters in it way after I saw YA get it. And it was, very exciting. Middle grade students are these fully formed human beings. Well, not fully formed, but, they're complex. And they lead complex lives, and they need all kinds of stories. And I just remember being really excited to see those waves of books come out. But still, relatively few of these LGBTQIA stories are being told to middle grade readers. And there's still a need for what people might call issue-driven books. Like when I was younger and I was going to read about a Jewish character, she couldn't just be living her life. It'd be like, let's talk about the Holocaust now. Or let's Rosh Hashanah, let's explain it. She couldn't just go be herself. There had to be an important lesson, these issue-driven books. And sometimes for queer middle grade, it's a lot of the process of coming out. But, queer readers still want to see themselves as like heroes and adventurers and up to shenanigans, just like straight kids have gotten to be in books for ages. How do you, the difference between issue-driven books and sort of incidental queerness books, or I call them just so happens to be books. The protagonist just so happens to be. How do you straddle the line when writing and dealing with both kinds of narratives? That was rambling. Did that make sense?
Yeah,
Yes.
Actually, if I can jump in, because I feel like I had a really specific experience with King and the Dragonflies. I feel like books are in conversation with each other. And I feel like the history of books are kind of like a trajectory of you kind of have to like have a conversation first for everyone to be on the same page. And then it can like build to the books that are incidentally, this is just my opinion, but books that are like incidentally, we get to be who we are without having to talk about it. And with King and the Dragonflies, I did have a conversation where my editor and like a couple of other editors kind of like read it and had like some thoughts about how many like discussions there were about Blackness and about queerness and about whiteness, and how it wasn't kind of like a straightforward adventure. And I felt like, well, this is the first time that I'm seeing a middle grade with a Black boy protagonist with like a white best friend who's also queer. Like, I feel like this conversation has to be had first, almost to like kind of like start that conversation. And then I feel like a reason I also write super quickly is because I really want to get to those books where it's just a queer person of color who's just the hero. And we don't need to like sit down and talk about the fact that we're Black and we're queer and we're trans. Like, I want that. So I'm like, okay, did King and the Dragonflies. I love that book. I feel like it's important, but I'm also like super excited to write like 5 other books so I can get to the book where we don't have to have those conversations anymore. And I think that some people would disagree. And it's like, you know, we don't have to have these conversations. We can jump right in. I think that there are books like that exist. But I also kind of feel like, I don't know, just looking at even like the history of children's books in general, people tend to say, oh, the older books were a bit more like didactic and a bit more like, we're sitting down, we're gonna have this conversation now, you know? I feel like there's a reason for that.
There does seem to be a, like when I read my Goodreads reviews, I've had reviews of both of my books so far from people who seemed to be expecting a lesson book. And their review is partly, well, this isn't what I was expecting. For example, in Felix, just for fun, I made almost all the characters queer in one way or another. And in Zenobia, I did it on purpose because I wanted to depict queer community, the power of queer community. And in both cases, I've had reviews where people said, just pick one and teach us about that instead of doing all of them at once. This is too much. And, you know, it's dismissive. It's as though there's a group of readers out there who have the idea that if there's a book about a person from any marginalized group, that book is going to be a lesson about what those people's lives are like. And that's all you're allowed to do. It's like there's a statutory limit on how far you can go into the world. And I'm opposed to that. And I'm interested, with each new project, I'm approaching afresh the challenge of balancing just great story and writing and characterization with something that I do want to teach. You know, I want to at least demonstrate, not if you know, not lecturing people ever, but at least put something out there that aware readers might find themselves engaging with, whether they originally planned to or not. So it's a new challenge each time. I find that liberating. I find that fun. It's part of the creative process. It's like, okay, how am I going to balance this time? So yeah, it makes the writing more fun from a geeky writer geek perspective.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I also, you know, I'm not supposed to read my Goodreads reviews, but I have. I find them fascinating. I don't know. I find them really fascinating. But, you know, my debut is about a Black girl who is adopted into a white family and sort of her 6th grade years, and thinking about, you know, at the forefront is sort of, who am I? What does it mean to be Black? And so it's very much about that. But it's also a story about mental health. It's about, you know, being a child who has a parent who's living with a mental illness. It's also about, you know, first crushes and friendship and dynamics between a Black sister and a white sister. And so I'm interested in writing stories that, you know, deal with intersectionality and deal with that nuance. And so it's interesting to read the reviews that are about, you know, our people are mad when it becomes about more like the mental illness takes the forefront in the book. And so I think it's interesting because, you know, Black characters, queer characters live at all types of intersections, right? And so wanting a book that is only specifically about one thing, and especially when it's a white reviewer, is really an interesting thing that I've gone off on a couple times on Twitter about as well. But yeah, I think Kacen, what you said also resonates as far as just, you know, I do want to write into this void, and you know, and so sometimes I think some of the more sort of issue-driven things do take a forefront. But I'm also I have a secret project I'm working on right now, and you just jump in, and the characters are, you know, who they are, and that's who they are, and the plot is driven by something else, and I'm really excited about that. But I also have that problem where I need to be working on the current book, but I have like 17 ideas for the next book. So I think, you know, yeah, I'm interested in intersectionality in those stories that provide nuance, and I'm not interested in writing towards sort of what someone wants. And I think when I start a new project, I have to think really carefully about why am I starting this project, and who does it serve, and make sure I'm writing from a place that feels good to me, and not because, you know, I've been swayed by reviews or by publishers or someone saying like, you need to make this hit a little harder on the race stuff or on the queer stuff, and just write what feels true, I think is how I'm trying to approach it. I'm still a newbie too, so.
Yeah, so as for Goodreads, you can filter and only read like the 4- and 5-star reviews.
Only 5-star.
Only 5-star. Oh,
Only
you're good. No, but what I actually do read them because I find folks who have come into their own from having read my books. I find kids and adults who say like, I'm trans and this is the first place where I saw it and this is where I was able to like, so I'm like, I do really appreciate reading those. And anything that has anything to do with the writing was simplistic or the characters sounded immature, well, they are 10, so I think I did it right. But the complaint that does come through is that some people are like, well, it's didactic. And well, I'm an educator and I'm a lefty and I don't trust anyone who calls themselves an activist, but I do activist work. And in order to work on a piece, I have to be with it for like 3 years, right? Because I have to be with it for a year or 2 or 3 or more to write it. And then I have to be with it to bring it out into the world. So for me, it has to be something that's doing something that I want to do in the world for 3 years. So I am going to write issue books, but they're not always going to be, oh, look, there are trans people. Oh, look, there are queer people. It's going to be, what does it mean to figure out that there are queer people in your past? And what does it mean to be a hearing white person who has a deaf black friend? Like, how do I tell about privilege? How do I tell about other stories that, are didactic because they are young and they're learning things and they're not hearing about some of these things at school. And so a book or parents or whatever, and a book is a way to get that to them. So I write issue books, but they're not always going to be the issue you are looking for.
Number one, if any of you need some sort of intervention when it comes to reading your Goodreads reviews, you can find me. I will talk you down from that literally whenever you want to. Second,
she's really good at it.
Sometimes. It makes me furious to think that anyone would ask you to pick a lane in any of your books. Our children don't get to do that. They don't get to pick and choose what in their lives they get to deal with. It's just like everyone else's life. Everything comes at you really fast and you deal with it all at the same time. So I appreciate everyone navigating all those lanes together. I am not going to speak for anyone but myself, but I was raised by adults in my life who,
so was I.
Alex is also already clutching pearls, but there's more. To understand sexuality and gender in this excruciatingly binary sense. And I feel like in the last third of my life, it's been this like turbocharged, caffeinated education about LGBTQIA and everything that it surrounds and every letter that I left out. Can you speak to the challenges you face writing for a community whose language and ways to identify is constantly in flux and evolving?
I'll be honest, I'm not sure I understood the question completely. If someone else did, then they can talk and then I'll try to jump off.
Can we try it one more time?
I think I have a handle on it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It was my question, and I'm still intimidated by it. And what I mean is, we're writing in 2020, where we're using the words from 2020, but the words in 2022 might be different. And the words that I used in 2015 were different, and I wrote a lot of that in 2005. So at what point, I mean, I've messed it up from the front that I dead named my main character in my debut. Her name is Melissa, and there's no way that I can like scream it loud enough to get it across as well as the title dead names her. So every time I'm writing something, well, is that gonna be dated in 2 years? And I mean, I guess my answer to it is that I'm experimenting, and some of my stuff is gonna be dated. And I put quilt bag into my book, which I know is not gonna take off. because they know it doesn't. People don't like the bag. But to be able to talk about, we're not done figuring out the language yet, and we are in flux, I felt like was something important to address. Because I've seen kids who are like, oh, well, I can't use that's old language. And I'm like, well, that's language I used. And it's hard.
This is not just a puzzle that has to do with the languages, the ever-evolving language of rainbow human culture. This is slang, and it's internet stuff. I mean, we're dealing with a 2 to 3 year lag in publishing here. For me, the answer has been inventiveness and craft. In Felix, I gave Felix his own particular slang and swear word that he made up himself. So it's just his language, and it's just part of his character and his voice. And it's timeless because it was never in. It was how my 14-year-old boy was talking at the time. So I just borrowed a bunch of language from my own quirky kid and gave them to the character I was writing. And as far as internet stuff, I just make up fake things. I've invented, a fake gaming platform, imaginary anime programs, just because anything you reference aside, I mean, I have a Minecraft reference in Felix. I think Minecraft is going to be around forever, but you couldn't reference what kids were playing with in a book and expect it to be current still in 2 years when the book came out. And the other one is it's a internet slang, and then the LGBTQ words. I like to give my characters their own quirky ways of saying that. So, in the manuscript I'm working on now, my kid just talks about being sort of feeling in between. And it's not a trendy word, but it's a descriptive word, and it'll still make sense in 3 years and in 10 years and in 20 years. So I think there's craft answers to this puzzle. There's ways to use voice and invent language to circumvent the problem.
Oh, certainly. And with pop cultures, I'm a big fan of using my favorite writers and turning them into musicians. So, like, there's an Angie T song in my book. And there's a poet named J.S.N. Reynolds and stuff. Like, I just play with it. But I feel like with queer language, I also want to be spreading out the words that are trending, because I want to give them the right to, like, be words.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it.
I feel like I don't, I force myself not to worry about this as much, because I do think that the books are, like I said before, like the books are in conversation, there's a trajectory, there's like a timeline, and these books are a part of history now. Like our books literally have come out in the past. So, and I think about how even like transgender words have like changed so drastically. We don't say words like transsexual anymore. We don't say words that would be considered inappropriate now. As long as there is like across the board an understanding that this was a part of our history, and it's not to say like we're trying to harm like the current language that will be used. I think that's the understanding that I give myself and I give every other book. And then I also think about how we are all going to continue writing. So we're going to write books that are going to be like 5, 10, 20 years from now, hopefully. And those books will continue to be a part of that cultivating of that language. So that's how I force myself to think about it. The pop culture stuff, I do understand, like literally in Felix Ever After, I was in like the past pages and I was like, oh, they're listening to Drake. I am so old. I am like, millennial. And I changed it to they're listening to BTS.
Yeah. I would also say that we have to trust, that some of our young readers are also going to become authors at some point too, and write their own stories, and that language is always evolving, right? And so I think trying not to worry about it too much, because I also think that sometimes then if you put too much pressure on yourself, you end up inserting things into your book that make it not feel authentic. And I feel like readers can tell when you've tried to use like a slang word or a term that you're not familiar with or comfortable with. And so, starting with the knowledge that you have, and then also just in those moments where you're interacting with young people and maybe they say, well, this is how I identify, is just remembering that and listening, right? And validating that identity and validating that language that they're using. And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to think through as I'm writing my stories. And then also knowing that no book is ever perfect and not going to be able to predict everything that's going to happen in the future. So to do my best that I can now, and then work on learning and moving forward as I hopefully write more books as well. But yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I have a lot of music in both my books, and some of it, the character knows and she talks about as like old people music, but she loves it. And then some of my references now, the book is out, I'm like, oh man, that's not what kids are listening to these days, but yeah, it's there. And I also just think about like, books that I go back to and read that don't have necessarily language that I would use in it, but I still find some thread in and am able to sort of critique and then also gain something from too. So yeah, I think language is always evolving, but it's also important for us to think about that as well as we continue to write.
Thank you for all of that. What have been your experiences in the publishing industry? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the publishing industry when they're working with you as authors of queer middle grade titles?
This was my question, so I guess I'll go first. I already mentioned one of the big ones, which was the disconnect I felt between what I thought I was doing and what the industry said what categories my industry said my books fit into. And I continue to struggle with that. I have another project already completed, which has been out on submission once and was not picked up. And I rewrote extensively and have it out on submission again now. And I'm starting to wonder if I have finally figured out how to write a book that's too queer to be published by mainstream publishing. It started out with the what if there was a culture in society where children were raised without gender and given gender neutral names and pronouns, and with appropriate ceremony at a certain time in their growing up, got to choose what they would be called and what pronouns they would go by for the rest of their lives. And all of the characters are rainbow humans of some kind or another, practically. And it gets, a little theoretical, I suppose, a little dense, working out what that might actually look like and the sort of conflicts that it might lead to in families. And I just, there might be other reasons they don't like it, but right now I'm racking my brain because I think I have a really good story here and I can't understand why it's not getting jumped on. And maybe I have figured out something that just seems too out there for a cishet editor. I don't know, but the thought has occurred to me. And I think we've seen a very public kind of reckoning in recent weeks with the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, of people posting on booklet Twitter how much they make in advances, and to nobody's surprise discovering that white straight authors are being offered more in advances than authors of color or people from the rainbow spectrum. And it's a matter of representation, I think. How many editors are there who are not white, who are not straight, who actually live in some of these categories and can understand when a good story in one of those categories comes across their desk, and there aren't very many. So it's a very troubling thing. To their credit, the industry in general seems to be grappling with this in a real way right now. I mean, there's a lot of people whose hearts are in the right places, but I think maybe just sort of the path to working in publishing is a path of privilege. You have to be able to live in a big city without making any money for a couple of years. That's tough unless you have like family resources and so on. So, you end up with a lot of white people working in their 20s in publishing, and that leads to, I think, a certain mindset. It's interesting. It's a deep pool, and of course, I don't know everything, but I think there's still work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the hashtag publishing paid me was very specifically for Black authors to see like the disparity. And I do think it's and I think that's just important to know, because I do think that sometimes the conversations end up kind of like shifting a little bit into like other territories. And I mean, every single time I think about it, I'm still kind of like completely mind boggled that some man named Chip got like $800,000 for his debut novel, which anyway, I'm not going to go down this path.
800, yes.
$100,000. I'm not going to go down that path. But to answer the question, though, I actually worked in publishing. I was an associate editor at Little Brown Books for Young Readers. And that was a very eye-opening experience where I think that even now as an author, I feel like I'm starting to get into a place of like us versus them. And I remember being so frustrated by that when I was in publishing, because it's like I was working my little tail off to really try to create change. And I was like, I had a mentor, Alvina Ling, who had been there like 20 plus years doing all of this hard work, which is basically kind of like almost unseen, and who was like on our side. And, there are other queer people, there are other people of color who are really trying so hard. And on the author side, now that I'm no longer in publishing, I do feel like it's a little easier to be like, but you're not trying hard enough. Like, you're not, like, we're still seeing like these disparities. We're seeing like so much that still needs to change. But I myself kind of like have to remind myself of those days where it literally would take like a project that had a Black and queer main character and was told it was like, yes, we can go forward, but it's like really niche. So there isn't going to be like a huge like readership. And I know that there are so many conversations like that are constantly still happening, where it can be like you're that one person in the room. I was literally the one Black, I don't necessarily know about queer, but I was definitely like the only Black and trans person in the room like a lot of the time. So what does that mean when I'm facing like a lot of white people who are in publicity and sales and like the publisher, and I have to convince all these people that like this Black queer story is not niche just because you are not Black and queer yourself? I feel like there's a lot I could say about that, but let me stop myself before I go on for like another 30 minutes about it.
I mean, I'll just say, Kacen, you're absolutely right. My book, my first book, sold at the right time. I had been working on it since about 2005, and it sold in 2014, which is kind of like when the word trans hit all the things. And it was a traditional linear story of a white kid, binary gender, and everyone was like and it's gotten all sorts of love that I know is a product of, I can connect with this kid in all these other ways, and then I get to make the gender leap without having to do any of like the hard work. And it went to a white queer editor who loved it, and it went through all of the white folks who know queer people and are pro queer, and it was super easy. And then the second in my second book, I wanted to talk about a girl with white privilege. Everything went, oh well, now I don't know, maybe you're taking on too much because you're talking about deafness too, and me, from the place of privilege, was able to like do the parsing of, okay, this is when what I'm hearing is a legitimate critique of my work, and this is when I'm hearing someone else's bullshit. Sorry, someone else's junk, someone else's crap.
We'll bleep you. It's not a problem.
But to be able to do that from here, like, I can navigate that from the place of also being a white queer person in the room. So I don't know what it's like, and I just know that it is sucky and awful, and that's why we're seeing more white queer stories, is because the white queer, like you are saying, the white queer editors can slip right in.
I don't have much to add to what everyone has said. I think, I've had so far personally pretty good experiences working with editors, but also have been really frustrated by sort of the numbers coming out of publishing, and this idea that, oh, we have this type of book, so we don't need another one, right? Like this fills our slot for this specific type of book, and there's no room for any nuance or any other, story that deals with the same topics or issues or identities. And I think that's a problem, right? And I know that, I know, and I haven't worked on the publishing side, but I know, people are trying to sell books and there's a whole marketing and publicity team. And so they think about your title and what might work. And I think that's important, but I think it's really dangerous, this idea that, oh, your book is too niche and it's not going to reach enough people, because that's not, there are readers that need that book, that need that story. And, we're missing them. And so that is something that has just frustrated me as a whole with the industry. And when it comes to queer stories and when it comes to Black stories, is that just because you have one and it might be amazing does not mean there's not room for others.
If I have a white boy in my class who loves his dog, I can hand him a stack of books that I cannot carry on my own.
So many
boys who love their dogs. Marley Diaz talked about that in her book, whose name I just forgotten. Maybe the Kidlit people can just like zap it into my mouth and I can just lip sync it. Marley Diaz gets it wrong. She talks about how there's so many books about white boys and dogs. But other kids want options too. I don't want to just give them, here's the one book for you. I just want the whole cornucopia, and I feel like librarians and educators are begging for that too.
Books are consumable.
Yes.
You read one, then you need another one.
You can go have another. That is the motto of libraries. You can and then go have another. That's what I like to tell them. What queer creators, whether they be authors, musicians, are inspiring you right now or have inspired your work in the past?
This was my question, so I can answer, or I can start answering it. Honestly, I was really excited to be on this panel specifically because you all are some people who've definitely inspired me and that I've looked up to. But I think someone that I always go back to in moments of upheaval and just moments in general is Audrey Lorde, the poet and activist, womanist Audrey Lorde. And I've specifically been going back to Sister Outsider, book of essays, and specifically the essay on the uses for anger right now in this current moment. And this idea that anger can be productive and can produce action, and trying to sit with that in the current moment we're in right now and just in general. So that's an author who not just for that essay, but in general, when I think about writing stories that are own voices, thinking about how do I tell the truth and not be afraid to tell the truth in whatever form it takes. And so that's an author that I go back to again and again, a queer author, when I'm feeling it.
A couple people who come to mind. One is Leah Newman, who talks about, she wasn't planning to write a children's book, but she's a poet primarily, and someone came up to her, someone said to her, or I think she also wrote children's books, but she wasn't planning to write the lesbian book. But her friend said to her, like, my kids don't have a book with their moms in it. And so she's like, well, I can write that. And like, still, we're all products of the fact that Heather has two mommies got published. Like, we're all that pushed it so much further. So those folks who were writing when other folks weren't, right? And I think now about how there are so many folks writing and who are prolific, like you, Kacen. You make me angry with how fast you write.
Oh my God.
It's actually, you're doing it personally to hurt me, I believe. I know you gave a reason, but I think it's actually about me. I think that, I'm white, so I assume it's all about me. But it's not even so much one person, but just the fact that there's a whole Twitter verse.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the formerly mentioned crap on Twitter, but there's also a lot of folks who are able to go to speak and say stuff, and it's so fast and interconnected, and there's things that aren't books anymore that are just like magical and passing it along, and I'm just inspired by that like I'm still doing the craft from 5,000 years ago, right? I'm still like the scribe with the paper, and then there's people who are like multimedia mixing it up and oh.
And I'd love to jump in with that because sorry, there's like an echo. Does anyone hear that?
You sound good to me.
Okay. I'll try to ignore my own echo. It's like distracting me. But yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like the Twitterverse, I kind of like paused for a second because I feel so inspired by so much and so many people that it's like, I wish I could go, I feel like you took the right route, Mariama. I wish I could like think of someone who is like, you know, historical figure, someone who has, well, Audrey Lorde isn't actually that historical, but you know what I mean? Like someone who has like been like the foundation and the bedrock of so much. But my mind immediately does go to like the community that's happening like right now and how much I feel like we're all kind of like, for the most part, like linking together and really trying to like raise each other up. And I think of like Julianne Winters, Nick Stone, Cameron Garrett, I could go on and on and on. And I just feel like the knowledge that I'm not alone. And again, like in this conversation, and I can write like King and the Dragonflies, and I know that they're going to be like 5 other middle grades with Black queer people, and I don't have to write those 5 books, and I can actually jump to like the Black queer people
Yes.
a lot sooner than having to like continue this conversation of, okay, is everyone on the same page? We all get it now. I feel like that's what super inspires me and makes me happy about like our community today.
I want to answer this question with my other hat on, my state representative hat. I ran for office in 2018 because I was horrified by the results of the 2016 election. But I did not think of running for office for the first year after that election, because I self-selected out. I assumed that as a trans person, an out trans person, I couldn't get elected. And I did that to myself. And then a woman named Danica Rome got elected to the Virginia State Assembly in 2017. An out trans woman and like a heavy metal guitarist. She's amazing. She's an astonishing human. And she not only won, she won by campaigning her heart out on the issues. You know, she didn't run as the trans candidate. She just ran because she wanted to fix the horrible commuting problems in that part of Virginia. And she beat the self-proclaimed chief homophobe of Virginia, an incumbent who would have been entering his 13th term, and who misgendered her, refused to debate her. It could not have been sweeter. And when she won that race, I stayed up all night sort of thinking and writing. And then I talked to my wife in the morning and said, I want to run for office. Virginia did it, I can do it. And I think all of us here in this panel are early enough in a new process that we also too get to be trailblazers like that. And it warms my heart to think of some 14-year-old kid, you know, in a conservative school district where one of our books still managed to get on the shelf somehow, finding that, and not only receiving personal support and validation, but also maybe that germ is starting in their mind, hey, they did that, maybe I can do that too. And so lucky us, we get to help inspire the next generation. It's so exciting.
That's beautiful. I'm starting to cry just a little bit.
If they can see it, they can be it. And
Exactly.
every voice that comes through in middle grade lit is putting an idea of I can do it that was not in someone's head previously. And that's why I'll get all messy and verklempt and goosey around office. And I will try not to get messy and verklempt and goosey in this last question, which is, what are your hopes and dreams for the future of queer middle grade literature?
Everything, just everything. I just want, I just want people to feel like they can write anything and everything and that it will get published, like Lisa was saying before, where you don't have to worry about whether the publisher is like ready for it or not. And I want I want as many stories as there are us, so that we don't have to feel like we have like the burden of telling our story on our shoulders. We can tell our story and people will recognize that this is one story. We're not the monolith. I want hundreds of thousands and millions of stories. That's what I want.
I would add to that, I dream of a future, and I don't know how this is going to come about, where cis-het culture is more open to stories, so that I want to normalize the idea that anybody can read any story.
Yes.
And that straight white kids should absolutely be reading stories about queer Black protagonists and learning empathy, learning how to understand a different life and a different point of view. And whatever can happen in the vast support systems, the libraries and the schools and the bookstores, and on the internet, whatever can happen in those places to encourage more people to read more different kinds of books. I'm all in favor of that.
I agree. I think I would just add that my hope for middle grade is just also that some of the gatekeepers might step out of the way a little bit more when it comes to stories that they're allowing into their libraries or their schools. And just like what has been said, that it is just as important for, a straight white kid to read a story about a Black queer kid as it is for them to read stories about white boys with dogs. I don't know. Having all the stories at the table and knowing that there is room for all these stories. And just because, one story has been told, it does not mean that there can't be another at the table. And I think it's so exciting to be, writing middle grade, writing queer middle grade, but there are so many authors out there who are not being published right now, who could be part of this conversation, who could be on bookshelves. And so I think my hope is just that, I go into a bookstore and we're everywhere. And so that would be my hope for middle grade.
Alex, you're on mute.
You're not Mike. There you go.
Sorry, my kitty was playing with toys and I had to turn off the mic. It was loud. So all of that, but also I want the right people telling the stories. I want to go and find queer books by queer people, queer, like trans Black stories by trans Black people. I want stories that are genuine and are from those communities. And this is just at a really practical level. I want to be able to read a book with a trans character without having to read it, vetting it for representation. I want to read it and decide whether I like it or not whether I can recommend it or not. I can recommend all your stories, by the way. But there's so many that I'm people are like, oh, middle grade, what else is out there? I read George, Melissa's story. I read what else is there? I'm like, well, there's a couple things, but I want to be able to have kids come up to me and be like, I read this book, and I'd be like, I love that one too, instead of, oh, you read that book, okay. Yeah. That's what I want.
I want all of that too. I want all of that yesterday. I want all of that for every library and schools when we actually get to reopen. I am so appreciative of you all being here today. We're pre-recording this, so someone's going to watch it and look at it. And whoever that person is, if you haven't read Hurricane Child, if you haven't read For Black Girls Like Me, Shinobi of July, you don't know everything Jilly P, you can't tweet for 5 seconds on Twitter without finding a list of Black-owned bookstores to order from. Order from Black-owned independent bookstores. Be patient, because every independent bookstore is up to their nostrils in order. So we are going to be patient and polite when we are ordering these books. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I appreciate you so much. Be well,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
This has been
Thanks,
lovely.
Ingrid.
Thank you all.